Hi BookTube, it's Amy. So I thought I would do a quick Friday reads here before I get started with my day of work. So last weekend I started reading a little bit of this book, I Love It When You Talk Retro by Ralph Keyes, which is a nonfiction book about common sayings that perhaps we don't know the meaning behind. Now this is an American book, so it is American centric and deals mainly with American phrases, but there was one particular story in here that I found interesting, and I'm going to see if I can find it again. It was the story behind the saying white elephant. So a white elephant is here we go. By legend, when a king in ancient Siam, now Thailand, wanted to make life difficult for someone, he gave that person an albino elephant. Because Buddha's spirit was thought to inhabit these rare creatures, the recipient could not make it a beast of burden, nor could he sell his elephant. Instead, its new owner had to feed and house his huge white pet until he went broke. From this heritage grows our modern notion of the white elephant, any possession that's hard to dispose of but too valuable to dispense with. And so I've definitely heard the phrase white elephant, but usually it's been within the context of a white elephant gift. And a white elephant gift exchange is something that's often done at holiday parties around Christmas. And the goal is to bring sort of a silly gift, a gag gift, a gift that will make people laugh when you open it, something that you really don't want and that might be a little bit hard to get rid of. So for instance, a giant ugly birdhouse, or a gigantic stuffed teddy bear, or a container of silly putty with a crude joke on it, something like that. Or as I've got hanging in my kitchen, we didn't call it a white elephant gift at the time, but my friend got me sort of this gag gift calendar for Christmas, and it is llamas doing yoga poses, but it's even more bizarre because there are quotes on each month from people like Winston Churchill. So you just have this sort of proper inspirational Winston Churchill quote with a llama doing yoga. So that was an interesting little tidbit from this book. I haven't read too much into it, just a few pages. I don't think it's something that I'll read straight through, but definitely something I will pick up from time to time. And then, as some of you who follow me on Instagram may know, I started rereading Albert Camus' The Plague. And this is a book that I think I read back in 2017, maybe 2018. I did a review of it, but I'm not too proud of that anymore. In fact, I was sort of, slapping myself in the forehead when I started this book, because I think in my review I said that it was set in a French city. And of course, on the very first page, it tells you that it's set in French Algeria, in the city of Oran. So obviously, not a very good review back then. Perhaps I'll film a new one, but I've really been enjoying rereading this. Now, you could say it's timely, you could say it's not timely, perhaps not something that most people or a lot of people would want to be reading right now. But in some ways, I think reading about similar situations is often how I deal with certain things in my life. And so for me, reading this, it was very interesting to notice how Camus deals with people's reactions to this plague. So doctors' reactions, government's reactions in this city, everyday people's reactions, how people cope, how people try to sort of get out as, I'm the exception, this isn't going to affect me. You should just let me leave. I have nothing to do with this situation. And so I'm a little over halfway through, and things aren't quite at their worst yet. Of course, the disease described in Camus' The Plague is far, far worse than our current situation. We don't have horrible rats coming out in the streets to die. COVID-19 is not spread by fleas. It is not sort of an airborne illness that everyone is going to get. But it is an interesting read to pick up at this point in time. And I don't have my notebook with me now, but there's some very interesting quotes about how life changes as people respond to the situation that I will share in my review of this. So I'll set that aside. I'm sorry if that's not something you wanted to hear about today, but it is something that I'm reading. And then last night, I sat down and I read J.M.Barrie and the Lost Boys, the love story that gave birth to Peter Pan by Andrew Birkin. And I quite enjoyed this book. I didn't realize exactly how tragic the story of the family that inspired Peter Pan was. And of course, there's all sorts of insinuations about how weird it was that J.M.Barrie sort of insinuated himself into this family's life. But that aside, it is a very tragic story. You have these 5 boys. He meets them when they are playing in Kensington Garden, gets to know their mother, the father in the family. It's hinted in here, well, it's almost explicitly said in here that the father, Arthur, never really liked J.M.Barrie, despite his wife Sylvia's liking for Barrie and how his sons idolized him. It sort of indicated that Arthur was maybe a bit jealous, or their personalities rubbed each other the wrong way. But I think I can understand how it might make someone uncomfortable to have a man come into the lives of his children and into the lives of his wife and adopt the role of almost a father figure. And these boys began to call J.M.Barrie Uncle Jimmy. But it's just a very tragic story because Arthur died when his sons were still quite young of a tumor in his face, and he had this horrible surgery to remove part of his jaw. His tear duct couldn't control itself anymore, and he just died a very painful death because even after this surgery, the cancer in his face was still spreading. And then not 3 years later, the boy's mother actually succumbs to a different type of cancer as well. And J.M.Barrie takes on partial guardianship of these boys along with their nurse, their nanny, Mary. He and Mary didn't get along too well, but J.M.Barrie uses his great wealth that he's amassed as an author to look after these boys and their education, to take them on grand holidays. And he was someone who very much enjoyed playing with children, the aspects of imagination, and he was almost disappointed as the boys got older and no longer believed in the realness of the stories that he would tell. And Peter Pan was based first on George, who was one of the older boys, and then he would tell the stories of Peter Pan to Peter and to Michael, and eventually to Nico, who was the youngest, who was not very old at all, under the age of 5, maybe even closer to a year old when both his parents died. And so he takes on the care of these boys. They stay with him when they come back from Eton and Oxford. But the story gets even more tragic still because World War I rolls along and George goes off to fight in the war, goes off to the trenches, and is in fact killed, which is an absolutely horrific experience for the entire family and for Barrie, especially, who has grown up as a father figure. Now, it is hinted that perhaps J.M.Barrie had intense emotions for George as he got older, but there's no indication that there was anything improper going on. It's just, people bring that up because he was so close to this family of young boys. But it does seem to me that it was very much the relationship of a father and perhaps a mother. The author here describes J.M.Barrie's relationship with the boys as not only paternal but also maternal. He had a motherly instinct, so to speak. But regardless of Barrie's feelings towards George, he was hit quite hard by his death. And then not more than a few years later, Michael died. He died of drowning at Oxford when he was away at college with another boy, and it suggested that maybe it was suicide, maybe it was an accident. They sort of died together, clinging to each other, these two boys out in the water, and Michael couldn't swim, although he was learning. And so, was it an accident? Was his friend trying to save him and he pulled the other boy under? Or was it some sort of strange suicide pact? And the author speculates but doesn't come to a conclusion here. He does come to a conclusion that J.M.Barrie was not a pedophile, probably not. And, if something like that had been going on, I don't think the mother would have allowed this man in her home. I definitely don't think the father would have stood for it. I think you would have heard about it either from the boys themselves, the surviving ones who grew up, or from accusations from other people within the family or the friend circle. I think J.M.Barrie was just someone who was very young at heart and enjoyed spending time with children, enjoyed imagination, and because he had no children of his own, he adopted this family as his own. And so it's understandable that he would be quite distressed by the death of Sylvie, of Arthur, and of Michael, and of George. And after the death of Michael, he was really left very much alone. He had a garret, he had this nice house, he had all these books, this lovely library, he was a celebrated author. But after the death of George and Michael, he really didn't have anyone in his life who he was all that close to. Some of the other boys were a little bit resentful of J.M.Barrie just because of the way that he had tried to, or they had perceived that he had tried to usurp the role of their father after his death. There are some accusations that this supposed deathbed engagement between J.M.Barrie and their mother never really happened, and he made it up. It's hard to say, but I think part of it is because J.M.Barrie was such a shy man. He was only 5 feet tall, that perhaps he had a difficult time being perceived as somebody that someone like their mother could ever be in love with. And I won't say whether she was willing to marry him or not, but perhaps she was, because it would have made sort of logical sense, knowing she was dying, knowing her sons needed to be looked after, and knowing that J.M.Barrie was quite willing to do so and had the money to do so. Perhaps it was a way of legitimizing his involvement in their life going forward. But that aside, it is a very tragic story. J.M.Barrie is a very elusive character. He could be described often as cold, because you would go into a room with him and maybe one or two other people, and he would sit there in silence, never speaking a word. But he had this sort of dark, sarcastic sense of humor, as evidenced by many of his writings. And he loved imagination. One of the really interesting things about this book is the description of the first performance of Peter Pan. He wanted, the characters to fly in the play, but that technology only existed in a rudimentary form. There was a ballet company that had actors fly on stage before, but it was the sort of thing where you had to be hooked into this elaborate harness, and because it took so long to get you hooked up, you had to stay in that harness for the entire scene. But Barrie wanted a harness you could be hooked into in a matter of seconds, and so he worked with his team, and they worked with this ballet company to create a new harness and to train the actors and actresses, and they put on this phenomenal performance which was unlike anything people had ever seen at the time. It certainly wasn't what they expected. I think it was Bernard Shaw who actually, to sum it up, he said the play was strange and a piece of crap, essentially. Not in those words, but that's the drift I was getting. But it was a huge sensation. It was produced year after year. It was produced in America. It was produced in Paris, and it really made his career. Peter Pan first made his appearance in The Little White Bird, which I actually started reading last night after I finished this. The Little White Bird is not specifically a Peter Pan story, but Peter Pan does make an appearance there. That's where you first hear about children being birds from Kensington Garden who leave the garden, leave their state as birds to become babies. And the reason there are bars on nursery windows is because babies sometimes forget that they are no longer birds and fly out the window. And of course, once you fly out, you might lose the ability to get back. And that is when Peter Pan, of course, comes to find you. And that is sort of the myth of Peter Pan. That's what happened to Peter. He flew out, and by the time he realized he was no longer a bird and a baby, he had lost his ability to fly back. And so off he goes to Neverland, where he gets so enthralled in this world that he doesn't want to go back until he does. And he goes and he finds the nursery window barred and closed, and his mother with a new baby. And so he takes on this mythical status of sort of a friend and keeper of dead children. That's how it starts out. And then, of course, when the play Peter Pan comes along, you have this whole myth of Wendy and Michael. And it's interesting because Wendy wasn't a real name yet. It was an invented name. And of course, now you have lots of Wendys all over the English-speaking world, but at the time it was a new name that had been invented by a slip of the tongue of one of the children. I forget which one, but one of the children wasn't able to pronounce a particular word, and so the word Wendy came out, and it made its way into the play. And as the years went by, J.M.Barrie edited the play with each new performance, and so there are obviously very many different versions of the play out there, and there is different lines in the American version compared to the English version. You had a couple years in the adding of the line about how children can only fly with pixie dust, because children were actually going home after seeing this play, attempting to fly off their bed, off furniture and whatnot, and injuring themselves. And so that line was added to let them know that they themselves cannot fly unless they get themselves some pixie dust. And then to add to this myth, J.M.Barrie ended up taking photographs of the one boy, Michael, in this Peter Pan costume with the intention that he would commission a statue to be put in Kensington Garden. Now, the eventual statue was based on images of another boy, which I guess J.M.Barrie didn't like that so much, because to him, Michael at a certain age was sort of the quintessential Peter Pan. But this statue was made, and it sits in Kensington Garden today. But it was sort of smuggled in the dead of night, and Londoners woke up to this gigantic statue of Peter Pan. And the author doesn't get too much into it, but I guess there was a debate in the House of Commons about whether the author had a right to do so, and whether it was, beyond the limits of what should be allowed in public self-promotion. And I get the impression, I don't know for sure, but I got the impression from this book that J.M.Barrie perhaps did not have official permission to put this statue up. or if he did, it was not widely known, and perhaps it was just permission of the park. But there was a bit of controversy. But the important thing is, in the end, the statue stands, and I've seen pictures of that statue for many years, ever since I first read Peter Pan, and it is quite an interesting statue. So overall, this was a fascinating book. It does leave some questions about the precise nature of his feelings towards the boys and this family, but at least in this author's opinion, nothing improper took place, and it was really just a maternal, a paternal feeling, that of a parent that J.M.Barrie had for these boys. It's like he found a family and adopted that family. And, right or wrong, to insinuate yourself into someone's family that way, I think in the long run, he did a lot of good for those boys after they were orphaned. He ensured that they were able to go to good schools, that they had a good start in life, and he served as a father figure for them. And I don't know whether it's just the passing of time, the way we look at men and their relationships with children, but I'm thinking if this were a woman in his place, no one would speculate at all. They would think it was perfectly natural for a woman to be close with a group of children and to look after them, and to write letters to them, and to profess a paternal love for them. If it were a woman, you wouldn't think twice, but I guess because J.M.Barrie was a man, sometimes people suggest that things were not as they should have been. But I'll leave it at that. This is a 22-minute Friday Reads. I said it was going to be a short one because I was about to start work here. But I hope you're having a great Friday. Let me know what you're reading in the comments below, and I will see you in a little bit with another video, whenever that may be.